Let's move on to a situation in which we have a group of voters who are asked to offer their opinions or judgments on a set of propositions. And these propositions are going to be assumed to be interconnected in some way. Now, in this lecture, I want to focus on what's become known as the doctrinal paradox or the discursive dilemma. Christian List maintains an online bibliography of the literature that has been generated to analyze this issue. So let's set up the problem. Suppose that we have three experts, and they each independently form their opinion about three different propositions. And the propositions, or the statements, are going to be connected in some way. So we have the proposition P implies Q, and the proposition Q. So for concreteness, let's assume that P is the statement, carbon dioxide emissions are above threshold X. And P implies Q is the statement, if carbon dioxide emissions are above the threshold X, then there will be global warming. And finally, Q is then the proposition, there will be global warming. Now, we're going to assume that our three experts form their opinion, and the only assumption I'm going to make is that the experts' opinions are logically consistent. So what does that mean? Well, let's say expert 1 judges both P to be true and P implies Q to be true. So according to the rules of classical logic, Q has to be true in this case. So I'm going to assume that expert 1 also then judges Q to be true. So the constraint on the experts is just that their judgments are logically consistent. Expert 2, let's say, judges P to be true and Q to be false. Well, according to the laws of classical logic, that means expert 2 has to judge P implies Q to be false. And finally, expert 3 judges P to be false, P implies Q to be true, and so and also Q to be true. Of course, there's nothing. Classical logic is not constraining expert 3 in his judgment about Q. He can judge Q however he sees fit because he judges the antecedent of this conditional to be false. So expert 3 judges P to be true, P implies Q to be true, and Q to be false. So now we ask, what is the group opinion? What's the majority opinion? So let's go through and calculate. For P, the group judges P to be true. Why? Well, expert 1 and 2 judge P to be true, so a majority judges P to be true. How about P implies Q? Again, a majority judges P implies Q to be true. How about Q? Well, the majority opinion for Q is that it's false. Experts 2 and 3 judge Q to be false. And so the majority opinion is that Q is false. So why is this a paradox? Well, I've assumed that expert 1 is consistent, expert 2 is consistent, and expert 3 is consistent. But that property doesn't lift to the level of groups using majority rule. Using the majority opinion is not consistent. Of course, we've seen this phenomenon before with the Condorcet paradox. Condorcet assumed that the voters' preferences are transitive, and that property, transitivity of the preference relation, doesn't lift to the level of the group preference ordering. Let's look at a different version of the same phenomenon. Now, let's just suppose that P is the statement a valid contract was in place, and Q is the statement there was a breach of contract. And let's say R is the statement the court is required to find the defendant liable. Now, let's suppose that the law is you find the defendant liable if and only if a valid contract was in place and there was a breach of contract. So now our experts, voters 1, 2, and 3, let's say they're judges. And of course, they have to be committed to the law. So they have to judge P and Q if and only if R to be yes. They have to judge that, they have to say that that's true or they have to agree to the law. This is a constraint placed on all of the judges. And now the judges are asked to offer their opinions about P, Q, and R. And so let's say voter 1 or judge 1 thinks P is true. It is true that a valid contract was in place, and it is true that there was a breach of contract. So according to this law, it is true that the court is required to find the defendant liable. What about voter 2? Well, voter 2 thinks a valid contract was in place, but there was no breach of contract. And so is now required to respond no to the question R. So Judge 2 does not think that the court is required to find the defendant liable. How about voter 3? Well, voter 3 does not believe a contract was in place, does believe there was a breach of contract, and so is not required to find the defendant liable according to this law. Now, a paradox arises if you ask the question, should we accept R? Should we find the defendant liable? Well, on the one hand, it seems like the answer should be no. You just look, what do the judges think about the proposition no? And a simple majority say that the answer is no. So the answer should be no. However, if we look at the judges' opinions about P and Q, note everybody accepts P and Q if and only if R. And if you ask the judges, do you think that P is true? They will all answer yes. Do you think that Q is true? They will all answer yes. And since P and Q are both true, and everybody accepts P and Q if and only if R, then it seems like the answer should be yes. So the paradox arises because if we think about the question, what does the group judge? What's the group's judgment of the proposition R? If we think of that question, there seem to be two inconsistent ways of answering that. One way is to take a conclusion-based approach and just simply ask, what do the judges think of the proposition R? What's their opinion about the proposition R? The second way is to take a premise-based approach and ask, what do the judges think about each of the premises or the components of R? They ask them about P and ask them about Q. Based on that, it seems like the answer should be yes.